Afrocentrism, Mythical Past and Imagined Homes by Stephen Howe, narrated by Eminent Wadi. Introduction. If somebody uses tradition as a way of limiting your choices in a way that's as racist as saying you had to sit at the back of the bus. Anthony Davis, quoted in Locke, 1988, page 1. Afro-American pianist and composer Davis was thinking primarily of those critics and music industry moguls, mostly white, who seek to block black artistic creativity by imposing restrictive, monolithic, or romanticized notions of jazz or blues tradition on African American music. But his complaint applies powerfully to important modern currents in Afro-American thought. For a mystical, essentialist, irrationalist, and often in the end racist set of doctrines has arisen out of the cultural nationalistic milieu to occupy center ground of media attention in relation to black American thinking. The self-ascribed or preferred label for these doctrines is Afrocentricity or Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism may, in its looser sense or more modern forms, mean little more than an emphasis on shared African origins among all black people, taking a pride in those origins and an interest in African history and culture, or those aspects of New World culture seen as representing African survivals, and a belief that Eurocentric bias has blocked or distorted knowledge of Africans and their cultures. In this broad sense, a very great deal of the culture and intellectual history of African descended peoples throughout the Americas and, indeed, the world could be thought of as Afrocentric. Interest in these themes can be documented throughout those histories. It has had its European impact too, especially, of course, among communities of Afro-Caribbean descent, but also, notably, through enthusiasm for black diasporic musics among many whites. But in its stronger versions, which have appeared in recent years to be ascendant and to have arrogated the Afrocentric label to themselves, a far more cohesive, dogmatic, and essentially irrational ideology becomes evident. It provides a direct analog to the extreme forms of cultural nationalism premised on beliefs about race, which flourished in 19th century Europe. In this aspect, it reproduces all the essential features of what Walker Connor influentially baptized ethno-nationalism. Connor, 1994. Though there is, as we shall also see below, extreme vagueness over who or what exactly comprises the nation in question. Like 19th century European ethno-nationalism, or that evident among some 1930s Germans and 1990s Serbs, strong Afrocentrism is accompanied by a mass of invented traditions, by a mythical vision of the past, and a body of racial pseudoscience. In this case, much of it is centered on grotesque ideas about the skin coloring chemical melanin. For all this follows extreme intellectual and cultural separatism, involving belief in fundamentally distinct and internally homogeneous African ways of knowing and feeling about the world, ways which only members of the group can possibly understand. Even those who are apparently in-group members, by birth, ancestry, or pigmentation, can be excluded from it on ideological grounds, if they fail to accept the ideology's doctrines. But such failure can be attributed quite simply to brainwashing by the dominant Eurocentric culture. Thus, the belief system is insulated from the possibility of critique or falsification. Outside the USA, such views have been gaining increasing salience in Britain, Canada, France, and even in some parts of Africa itself, though it is striking and important that what Americans call Afrocentrism is not especially popular amongst continental non-diasporic African intellectuals. It is perhaps more clearly recognized by many of them than it is by some in Europe and North America that Afrocentrism in the contemporary narrow U.S. sense is largely a deviation or degeneration from the wider tradition of the politics of liberation, perhaps more an index of frustration than of progress. For the historian, there are at least three clusters of issues here, clearly distinct from one another, though also conceptually and even more politically related. There are, first, questions about the history of Africa, especially about the degree of cultural unity across the African landmass and cultures on the continent. Second, issues around the role of African peoples in the origins and development of diverse ideas, practices, and technologies generally recognized as being of global significance. Egypt, and especially its putative influence on ancient Greece, is again central here. Third, controversies about the extent and nature of African influences in what is often now called the African diaspora, controversies which have been especially salient in the relation to the United States, have interacted heavily with sensitive issues on current public policy, and involve questions both wide and fundamental about contemporary U.S. politics and culture. In general terms, relationships among these three sets of issues would be of interest to anyone who is curious about history, anyone who takes pleasure in looking at long-term patterns of historical change and the interaction of cultures, regions, and traditions across the great sweep of human development. That curiosity and pleasure are the main motivations for my main inquiry here. The story of Afrocentrism and its ancestors is a fascinating chapter in the history of ideas, whatever else it may be. The intrinsic interest of the questions raised compensates in part for the depression induced by a more particular, perhaps urgent, more directly political reason for linking the three spheres of concern. This more urgent political reason is that disputes over African history, over the sources of a bundle of attributes labeled civilization, and over the character of ethnic cultures in diverse North American and other societies have all but linked in violent argument around what is now called Afrocentrism. All these matters have, in the past few years, been raised with especial acuity in the USA. There, they have become central to the storm over multiculturalism and so-called political correctness in education, media, government policies, and in the sphere quite generally. Public controversy has centered particularly around the inroads Afrocentrism has made into school-level education in the USA. By 1991, it was reported roughly 350 private schools or Afrocentric academies devoted to the approach had been established, educating more than 50,000 children. The number has continued to grow. Numerous public school authorities have also introduced Afrocentric curricula, including wholly Afrocentric schools in predominantly black districts as Detroit, Baltimore and Milwaukee had done. Marable, 1993, page 120. Elsewhere, curriculum reform designed to introduce Afrocentric perspectives produced national-level public storms and political battles, as in New York and Washington, D.C. A first generation of explicitly Afrocentric school textbooks has begun to appear, e.g. Asante, 1995a, B, C, Crawford, 1996, Rashidi, 1992. The disputes have given rise to a massive polemical literature, including such bestsellers as Dinesh D'Souza's Illiberal Education and the End of Racism, Robert Hughes' Culture of Complaint, and Arthur Schlesinger's The Disuniting of America. Yet U.S. debate over everything from Frederick Douglass's autobiographies to rap lyrics have been persistently parochial, mistaking for American phenomena what are actually much wider ones. The culture wars of recent years in the USA have, to a quite astonishing degree, been almost exclusively focused around revival versions of Americanism, even or perhaps especially when some protagonists have been proclaiming their Africanism. Advocacy and criticism of education or multiculturalism have rarely been about what school children and students should know of the world, but about what they should be taught of the histories and beliefs of various social groups in the USA's own population. It is the We Are the World syndrome with a vengeance. Necessarily, what follows here focuses heavily on those American disputes, though unlike almost all the vast outpouring of words in the United States on these questions, I also give substantial attention to related themes in European and above all in African controversies. This is in part to register a protest and to indicate an alternative, as writers like Robert Ferris Thomas and more recently Paul Gilroy have shown. The ideas and cultural forms of black communities, like those of other ethnic formations, on all the shores of the Atlantic have composed a single story, an elaborate pattern of call and response. This makes a nonsense of the national frameworks within which black history and culture are usually discussed, and that pattern in its turn is far more influentially intertwined with the central themes of Euro-American modernity than is ordinarily thought, which means that dominant discourse is about Europeanism, Englishness, Americanism, modernism, and postmodernism, with their mirror image. Currently fashionable Afrocentric theories also need drastic revision. Much the same is true of the Mediterranean world 3,000 years ago as well as today. Black Athena is a slogan just as false to history as is white Egypt. In what follows, I have tried to show that the views of writers usually labeled Afrocentric are largely erroneous, in part by comparing them against the opinions on the same subjects of various other writers. What matters to me, and, I hope, to almost all readers, is that the writers whose views I prefer are more expert in their subjects, more careful and coherent in their arguments, offer more and better evidence and higher standards of clarity and logic in pursuit of the beliefs they advance than their opponents. Some, however, will think that it is more important that those I judge negatively are mostly, though very far from all, of at least partial African descent, while those I assess more favorably are often of European or Euro-American origin, though very many are not, and in some cases I am quite ignorant and happily uncurious about their ancestry of skin color. Those who are fixated on the view that racial or ethnic origin inevitably dictates intellectual position will no doubt therefore dismiss the ideas of many of these authors, and will dismiss mine for the same reason. So be it. That fundamentally racist attitude to intellectual inquiry is, as I shall argue, the most basic of all the faults in the work I examine and judge negatively in the following pages. Yet by no means all, or even most, of these charges stick against all the writers I analyze here. Some of them seem to me to have made genuine and crucial contributions to knowledge and to political enlightenment. The works of Sheikh Anta Diop, St. Clair Drake, and Martin Bernal in particular have power and importance for their negative critique of European colonial arrogance and its latter-day legacies. They remain significant for that necessary debunking function, even if there are grave problems with the positive cases which these authors offer to replace the views they assail. Much of the earlier historical writing by Afro-Americans within what has called the vindication tradition, Drake, 1987, preface, page 15 through 1, can be defended on similar grounds, even where the authors made what now appear quite inaccurate or exaggerated claims about Black and African achievement. They provide an impassioned corrective to Euro-American and European disparagement. As such, writing like this takes its place in the long history of intellectual decolonization of which Edward Said has written movingly in his Culture and Imperialism and elsewhere, and of which Said's own works are among the most distinguished modern examples. I do not seek to imply that all or even most Afrocentric writers are deliberate intellectual frauds, though I think some certainly are. More probably sincerely believe in the ideas they propound, or think that the political or sociological usefulness of those ideas outweighs their often dubious intrinsic merit, or adopt some mixture of those two stances. The latter, the belief that however questionable the claims about history, culture, collective psychology, or science made by Afrocentrists, they have positive confidence building or identity affirming functions, would be, if it were true, the strongest defense of the movement. The prominent African American historian Wilson J. Moses has suggested something of the sort. Like most mythologies, it is only half believed and simply represents an attempt on the part of respectable, honest people to create a positive folk mythology. Quoted in G. Thomas, 1995, page 28. One can certainly accept that more or less honest people, in their capacity as political activists, might seek to build a positive folk mythology which encourages those they wish to mobilize, even if they do not wholly believe in the propositions they advance. It is less clear whether honest intellectuals can properly behave in such a way, using their university post, editorships, classroom or media access, and the apparatus of scholarship to do so. Still less whether such a stance is compatible with the insistent claims of most Afrocentrists that they are recovering the truth of African history from others' myth-making, that they are pioneering a new scholarly discipline, or even a science. More importantly, however, I do not think that the faith in the political or psychological benefits of false folk mythologies is justified. It depends on two beliefs: that false and mythicized ideas can, even in principle, be politically captivating, and that the particular false ideas propounded by Afrocentrists can have positive political consequences under the particular circumstances in which they are propounded. The first, I think, would be true of Afrocentrism only if politics were always and only a zero-sum game. If we win, you must necessarily lose, setting ethnic or racial collectives against one another. This is not the case. Even in the contemporary USA, politics is, at the least, a great deal more complicated than that. Presenting it in terms of grand simplicities is of advantage only to a few individuals who can gain influence by claiming to speak for the imagined communities whose leaders they pretend to be. The second is, in my view, also false, for reasons which will be explained further on, but which come down to the observation that Afro-Americans' problems are above all problems of economic deprivation and cannot be remedied by approaches which entirely ignore economics. This is still more true of Africa itself. I am convinced, therefore, by the widely voiced claims that Afrocentrism, perhaps especially at the level of high school education, is of psychological, cultural, or political benefit to African Americans, providing resources to combat racism and other disabilities under which they labor. Its characteristic emphasis seem to me, on the contrary, often to be barriers to or digressions from the development of effective strategies against racism and for social justice. It might, of course, still be, though, that Afrocentrism is primarily a cultural psychological phenomenon rather than an intellectual or pedagogic one. On some levels, this is certainly true, notably for such ideas influence in popular culture, for instance in rap music. However, these aspects are not my main focus here. Whatever else it may be, Afrocentrism is also an educational intellectual movement whose proponents make very strong claims about the true value of their ideas, especially their ideas about history, but also about psychology, anthropology, and various natural sciences. Indeed, their characteristic stance, far from asserting that they are putting forward useful or psychologically captivating myths, as Moses' diagnosis would imply, is to say that their views represent the true historical reality, long suppressed and concealed by European racist misconceptions or lies. As Gerald Early perceptively points out, Afrocentrism resembles many earlier nationalistic ideologies in being. The orthodoxy of the books, an attempt to wed knowledge and ideology, movements like Afrocentrism, which feel both in mission and its authority hinge on the revelation of a denied and buried truth, promote a fervent scholasticism, a hermeneutical ardor among true believers for complications of historical minutiae on the one hand and from grand philosophical tracts on the other. 1995, page 34. It is on that level, the level of the true value of Afrocentric claims, that I seek primarily to assess the movement. In the end, indeed, I believe that most of the arguments about the racialization of scholarship, proposed in recent years from a wide range of perspectives, are an evasion of or a distraction from serious political issues in relation to Africa and its diaspora, as much as for anywhere else. To observe that scholarly perspectives on African and diasporic societies have been massively influenced by racial ideology is one thing, and it's obviously true. To analyze those histories of racialized scholarship and to trace the ways in which writers' own ethnic origins have influenced their views are important and fascinating tasks. But it is quite another thing to believe that such analyses offer significant aid in solving contemporary political or economic problems, let alone to think that the erection of counter-myths about African racial superiority or unitary transhistorical black perspective does so. At the height of the bitter battles in the American African Studies Association, battles which play a walk-on part in the story told here, Pierre L. Vandenberg pointed out, overgeneralizing in his anger, but with, I believe, an essential powerful truth that the African peasant does not care one whit whether his oppressor is white or black. Rightly, he does not consider race relevant. It should not be a matter of deepest shame to us intellectuals that we still talk as if it were relevant. 1970, page 336. If anything, that is even more true today than it was over 25 years ago. It should hardly be necessary to say that all these traits can be found parallel in many other parts of the world and among many U.S. groups other than African Americans. Indeed, they seem ubiquitous wherever history is pressed into service in ethnic contestation. There is no intention here of seeking to imply that the mostly Afro-American writers analyzed are uniquely blameworthy, or that African American culture is somehow more credulously disposed than any other towards mythicized self-legitimation, racially charged fantasies of origin, or mystical pseudo-history. Every intellectual failing identified in this book has its parallels elsewhere, often parallels that have done or could do vastly greater political damage than those that are popular in some sections of the African American public sphere. Virtually every European state and ethnic group has drawn on and abused the discipline of archaeology in its search for historical roots, often involving straightforwardly racist ideas about the origins and destiny of itself and its neighbors. See, for example, Diaz Ardru in Champion, 1996. In the cases I know best, those of Britain and Ireland, very long histories of utterly fantastic racial myth and ideas about the national past and origins can be traced, involving all the elements of mysticism, claims of racial primacy and superiority, and promiscuous borrowings from esoteric lore and Masonic tradition, which we shall observe operating in the African American case. This was not just the preserve of mystics or irrationalists. Central figures of the European Enlightenment held not only racist ideas, but ideas which now appear utterly grotesque about racial difference, national character, and human origins. See, for example, Easy, 1996, 1997. Nor is it merely a matter of the European past, of an intellectual stage now transcended. The immense and gullible appetite of contemporary Europeans and Euro-Americans for occult, irrational, and fantastic histories is evident from the shelves of almost any bookstore, where such works commonly command far more shelf space and greater sales than works of genuine history. These works frequently revolve around many of the same things as those popular in romantic Afrocentrism. Theories about the lost wisdom of ancient civilizations, especially that of Egypt, bizarre claims about the history of Freemasonry, a theosophism, stories of lost continents, and so on. As we shall see, indeed, these are not only parallel but often interconnected stories, with African American vindicationists and fantasists often drawing heavily on various earlier European racial theories and bodies of esoteric thought. Perhaps the worst thing one could say of the more eccentric African American writers discussed below is to adapt Mark Twain on the Jews, that they've shown they can be just as bad as everybody else. Few, if any, of the polemicists who have assaulted Afrocentric and related intellectual trends in the U.S. culture wars of recent years appear to have read much or even any of the Afrocentrist work. Dinesh D'Souza, 1991, Arthur Schlesinger, 1992, Robert Hughes, 1993, Robert Bernstein, 1994, and others refer almost exclusively to newspaper reports on it rather than the writings themselves. Mass media attention to Afrocentrism and associated beliefs can be said to have started with the polemical writings of D'Souza, a young conservative journalist and researcher at the right-wing think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. The book which contributed most to beginning the rather artificial controversy over political correctness in academia, Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, Bloom 1987, had not specifically targeted Afrocentrism or black studies, though it had bemoaned affirmative action programs and separatist sentiment among students. Afrocentrism was only one of the targets of D'Souza's freewheeling, often slapdash assault and illiberal education on multiculturalism, political correctness, and left-wing academia. He sneered at the young enthusiasts at Howard University and elsewhere who were, in his terms, in search of black pharaohs, but he did not look at their ideas either closely or fairly. Soon thereafter, though, the distinguished historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. joined the fray with an equally polemical but more thoughtfully argued book, The Disuniting of America. Schlesinger mounted his critique from the standpoint of a New Deal liberal as contrast with D'Souza's neoconservatism, but he was no less hostile to the eruption of ethnocentricity. 1992. Page 15. In the worlds of education and public policy, he believed that a resurgent ethnocentrism in cultural politics threatened the all-important traditions of the USA as an integrationist melting pot, especially in its insistence on teaching history as philopatistic commemoration. 1992, page 99. The result was to sanction and deepen racial tensions, page 69, and threaten equally the academic values of accuracy and objectivity and the political values of tolerance and liberalism. He placed Afrocentrism more firmly in his sights than did D'Souza, seeing it as representing many of the worst excesses of the general cultural trend he deplored. The noted art critic Robert Hughes went in, if anything, even harder, though his Culture of Complaint 1993 has the merit of assaulting the patriotically correct idiocies of the right as well as the politically correct ones of the left. The Afrocentrists and allied trends Hughes believes are proposing not an informed multiculturalism, but a blinkered and wildly polemical separatism. 1993, page 129. Hughes' notion of Afrocentric ideas, like Schlesinger's, is apparently based on an extremely narrow reading. He cites the Senegalese historian Cheikh Anta Diop and the British theorist Martin Bernal, but very few other Afrocentric writers, and may too readily associate Afrocentrism as a whole with the ravings of works favored by the Nation of Islam and black anti-Semites, such as The Iceman's Inheritance and the secret relationship between blacks and Jews. Page 137 through 8, page 143 through 4. In the end, Hughes believes Afrocentric beliefs want to create a separatist history and enforce it on kids who are still too young to dispute it. They amount to claims for purely remedial history with symbolic functions, part of a reaction of despair, frustration, and rage, and part of the universal tendency of insurgent nationalisms to fabricate myths about the past. Page 148. Another left-wing scholar and polemicist, the Afro-American political scientist Manning Marable, has been almost equally harsh in his judgments. Although Afrocentrism aims to provide the basis for an alternative worldview and oppositional consciousness, he feels it is essentially opposed to pluralism and diversity, blind to issues of gender and social class, and freezes the meaning of culture, reducing the dynamics and multiple currents of interpersonal and group interaction to a rigid set of ahistorical categories. Marable, 1995, page 122. Marable is suspicious of the movement's exclusivism, though he notes the irony that it is at least as often white administrators and academics as black separatists who harbor the hidden assumption that no one who was not born black would have any reason to cultivate a scholarly interest or the proper dedication for the study of black life and history. Marable, page 122-3. Above all, Afrocentrism neglect of economic realities damns it in his eyes. It looks to a romantic, mythical reconstruction of yesterday to find some understanding of the cultural basis of today's racial and class challenges. Yet the critical understanding of reality cannot begin with an examination of the lives of Egyptian pharaohs. It must begin by critiquing the vast structure of power and privilege which characterizes the political economy of post-industrial capitalist America. 1995, page 200. Dinesh D'Souza returned to the fray with the end of racism. 1995. Here, he or his research assistants seem to have read rather more widely than in his earlier polemic, and the new book included a much more detailed examination of Afrocentrism. His treatment of the theme, however, still seemed dominated by a desire for simple dismissal of Afrocentric ideas rather than tracing their roots or evaluating their claims. The book also expresses disconcertingly sharp prejudice and scorn towards African American communities. Its treatment of alleged genetic differences between racial groups is especially puzzling. D'Souza gives an extended and sympathetic précis of the views of those who believe there are significant inherited inequalities of intelligence, with African Americans scoring markedly lower than Europeans and Asians. Not only is his summary sympathetic, he distorts the theories of Sandra Scar and others to make them seem like clear-cut proponents of such views, which they are not. Especially, he caricatures the arguments of writers on the other side like Stephen Jay Gould, seeking to make them sound merely illogical or inconsistent. But after all this, the D'Souza insists that his own view is that cultural and behavioral traits, not genetic ones, determine the myriad failures he discerns in Afro-America. Therefore, the whole genetic argument is an irrelevance to his case. Why then has he presented it at such length and in such partisan fashion, unless on the old proverbial basis that if you throw enough mud, some of it must stick? The longest and most detailed assault on Afrocentrism to appear thus far has been Mary Lefkowitz's book, Not Out of Africa, 1996a. This, however, has a far narrower compass than its title would imply. Among the numerous different claims made by Afrocentric writers, Lefkowitz considers only one: Egyptian influence on ancient Egypt, primarily in the sphere of philosophy. Her main purpose is, quite simply, to defend the integrity of ancient Greece and a traditional classical scholarship against what she regards as Afrocentric calumnies. In this respect, she regularly slips into the kind of ethnocentric arguments against which she protests elsewhere. Lefkowitz complains that Afrocentrism robs the ancient Greeks and their modern descendants of a heritage that rightly belongs to them. 1996, page 126. Such untruths do injustice not only to the ancient Greeks who have been falsely maligned, but to their descendants. Page 168. Lefkowitz offers an extremely attenuated and in some respects inaccurate account of Afrocentrism's intellectual genealogy. For instance, she regards Marcus Garvey as having originated views which, as we shall see, he had in fact only popularized from very older sources. Page 130 through 34. Her explanation of how Masonic ideas fit into Afrocentric writing is equally inadequate. I attempt to provide a more satisfactory account of this odd byway in the history of ideas below. Lefkowitz's book, short as it is padded with various digressions. For instance, a seemingly irrelevant excursus on Mozart's magic flute, 56, 118 through 20, and much repetition. Some of her arguments are extremely questionable, and her eagerness to disprove Afrocentric claims that Cleopatra is black, on which she is no doubt correct. She insists far less plausibly that Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra does not depict her as being dark-skinned, a view that involves her in quite fanciful readings of passages in the play, 38 and 9. She attacks Afrocentrics for not being properly interested in relations between ancient Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa, a judgment which only ignorance about the range of Afrocentric writing could sanction. But ironically, her own single, brief reference to that issue is not only inaccurate, but African kingship, but relies on the same out-of-date authority, Henry Frankfurt, whose views underpin some of the wilder claims made by Diop and other Afrocentrists. Page 135. Lefkowitz proclaims an interest in sociology of knowledge and promises more than once to explain why Afrocentrism has had such appeal to some students and intellectuals. This, however, she never does. Her discussion of intellectual climates and traditions is brief and crude. She appears to associate Afrocentrism with postmodernist, textualist, and relativist approaches to historical study, with a view of history as a form of fiction. Preface 14, and confusingly describes such stances as cultural history, page 50, by which is usually meant the history of culture, but which she uses to mean history written from the viewpoint of cultural particularism. And New Historicism, page 50, a term normally denoting the approach of such literary scholars as Stephen Greenblatt, but for Lefkowitz apparently meaning mythicized history. Lefkowitz's conclusion, moreover, does not attempt to summarize the intellectual balance sheet of Afrocentrism's pseudo-historical claims, but discusses how best to mount a police action against them. It is hard not to suspect that the very particular controversies in which Lefkowitz has been engaged at Wesley College around the activities of her colleague Toni Martin, see below page 277 and 8, provide much of the stimulus for this. Her final pages are, in effect, a call for university faculties and authorities to censor Afrocentric courses, even as she believes that the first line of defense should be words, and when appropriate, even ridicule, page 171 through 2. Perhaps the most serious flaw in Lefkowitz's book, however, is that its analysis of Afrocentric writings is almost as narrowly based as those of Hughes or Schlesinger. She makes fairly brief reference to the work of Yusuf Ben-Jochannan, Sheikh Anta Diop, and J. A. Rogers, and has elsewhere Lefkowitz, 1992-1996b, criticized Merton Bernal's Black Athena, but her main target of attack and the only Afrocentric text she investigates in detail is George G. M. James' Stolen Legacy. James' little book has certainly had an influence, but the metonymic approach of allowing it to stand in for Afrocentric history as a whole is clearly inadequate. Other writings in the genre, many of them more substantial and coherently argued than James, have very grave faults, but they are not necessarily the same faults as his. Stolen Legacy is a work of the utmost intellectual naivety, innocence of even the outward appearances of academic procedure, to assail its inadequacies as a piece of scholarship in the way Lefkowitz does is to use a steamroller to crack a nut. Lefkowitz does not appear to have uncovered any information about James himself or sought to do so. His motivation, which he discusses in some detail, is not considered. Thus, Lefkowitz does not begin to fulfill her promise to explain how and why mythic or propagandistic histories come to be written, page 134. An adequate and thorough investigation of Afrocentric views of history would have to trace their genealogies through a mass of 19th and early 20th century Black American writing about Africa, to take detailed note of such major protagonists as Marimba, Annie, Molefi Asante, John G. Jackson, Ron Karanga, Ivan Van Sertima, and Chancellor Williams, and perhaps above all, to look closely at the most influential and intellectually substantial of them all, Sheikh Anta Diop. Lefkowitz does none of these things. I attempt them in the pages that follow. A far more substantial volume, co-edited by Lefkowitz and her Wesley College Guy McLean Rogers, appeared most simultaneously with Not Out of Africa, Black Athena Revisited, Lefkowitz and Rogers, 1996, a collection of responses to Bernal's work almost all of them highly critical by various classicists, Egyptologists, and others. This too, therefore, has a relatively restricted focus, but includes extremely important contributions by such major scholars as John Baines, Loin Brace, Robert Palter, Frank Snowden, and Frank Yurko. These findings and arguments will be discussed and drawn upon at various points below, especially on the chapter on Martin Bernal, chapter 15. One fairly elementary but widespread confusion should be dealt with at the outset. A common rallying cry among many involved in African American education, writing, and politics is the critique of universalism. The same is true in what has become labeled post-colonial studies and in some branches of feminist thought. Very often, this critique seems to confuse two or all of three rather than different issues. First, there is opposition to false or pseudo-universalism, criticism of a European particularism, or indeed chauvinism, which poses as universal, as it has evidently done in a great deal of modern Western thought. Such criticism of historic European or Western pretensions, which were often closely linked with European colonialism, has been a major and important part of the cultural politics of recent decades. Second, though, is the critique of what one might, albeit guardedly, call genuine universalism. Attack on or dismissal of values, practices, techniques which, there are good reasons to think, transcend particular cultures and traditions, or should do so. This second strand defends the local, the particular, the cultural specific of what it claims to be the traditional. It very readily slides towards nationalist, xenophobic, or racist stances. Third, and entirely different again, is the critique of philosophical universalism, the denial often associated with postmodernist theories that notions of truth, logic, reason, and so on can be held independently of particular countries or interpretive communities. The antithesis or counter to the first universalism, quite simply, awareness of and respect for cultural difference. The antithesis to the second, however, is particularism, shading into what Edward Said, 1993, calls nativism, and Samir Amin, 1989, provincialism. The antithesis to the third is an extreme relativism. For instance, a person who points out that the male-headed nuclear family is not a universal form of social organization, but a culture-specific one, and one that is neither ubiquitous nor in any strong sense traditional within Western Europe itself, is engaged in the first kind of critique. Someone who claims, as the Chinese and some Islamic governments did at recent United Nations human rights summits, that a universal code of human rights conduct is invalid because their country's cultural traditions dictate different and apparently much more restrictive conceptions of such rights, is mounting the second and, in my view, far less credibly sort of critique. And someone who says that the proposition, if A is greater than B, B cannot be greater than A, is true only in certain cultures, certain traditions of thought, and not in others. Not a far-fetched example, as we shall see in relation to some Afrocentric thinkers, is involved in the third line of critique. In my view, the first kind of anti-universalism is a valuable, indeed essential, corrective to European cultural pretensions and distortions of history. The second, however, is at best a profoundly uninteresting kind of cultural parochialism, and at worst, as with those repressive governments which used it to defend human rights abuses, or with some Africans' defense of female genital mutilation on grounds of tradition, an alibi for inhumane and regressive practices. The third is simply absurd. We shall be seeing all three, often muddled together, in operation in the theories discussed in these pages. My primary subject here, contemporary American Afrocentrism, is only one broad strand, not the only one, arguably not the most important, certainly not the most coherent or attractive, in the long story of New World appropriations of the image of Africa, as Stuart Hall says, reflecting on cultural identities in the Caribbean. The political movements in the New World in the 20th century have had to pass through the re-encounter with Africa. The African diasporas of the New World have been in one way or another incapable of finding a place in modern history without the symbolic return to Africa. It has taken many forms. It has been embodied in many movements, both intellectual and popular. S. Hall, 1995, page 9. But further on, Hall issues a warning which applies accurately to many of the ideas discussed in these pages. Africa is not waiting there in the 15th or 17th century, waiting for you to roll back across the Atlantic and rediscover it in its tribal purity, waiting there in its pre-logical mentality, waiting to be woken from its sight by its returning sons and daughters. S. Hall, 1995, page 11. Images and stereotypes of Africa may have been a constantly reoccurring theme in the histories of New World diasporic groups, but real practical engagement with the troubles of contemporary Africa has been a much more uneven story. As we shall see, it was very much a minority phenomenon amongst Afro-Americans, many of whom rejected the idea of having special ties to the African continent, at least until the 1950s, 60s era of decolonialization in Africa and civil rights in the USA. We shall be tracing aspects of Afro-American responses to Africa and its history, some of them surprisingly perennial, constantly recurring themes of romanticization and ambivalence. We shall not, however, be investigating the important but distinct theme of direct political engagement by African Americans seeking to aid the continent's liberation, a story which would run from Max Jurgen's Council on African Affairs, founded in 1937, through the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, the 1960s African Liberation Support Committee, and its successors, culminating in the major African American mobilization against apartheid in the 1980s. Different aspects of this constructive and often impassioned engagement have been analyzed by various scholars. Afrocentrists' contribution to these campaigns, however, appear to have been minimal. Few of the Afro-American culture nationalists who loudly proclaim their identification with Africa have seemed to evince a closer informed interest in the continent itself or have played any major constructive role in the political campaigns against apartheid, let alone against state repression in post-colonial Africa, or on behalf of the victims of genocide in Rwanda and famine elsewhere. That Africa, as Stuart Hall comment implies, and as many critics have complained, is an imaginary place without a real human history, as opposed to the mythographs of conquering kings, superheroes, and bucolic bliss which they construct, as well as without a present, not only without hunger, military coups, gender inequality, and genocide, but equally without TV stations and traffic jams, human rights movements, and contemporary artistic creativity. To my knowledge, no self-proclaimed Afrocentrist in North America has ever yet published a detailed, substantial study of any particular African society, past or present, ancient or modern, with a partial exception symptomatically of works about ancient Egypt. The attitude is very well summed up in the story of a friend recently told me about a U.S. academic conference a few years back, a story I have no reason to disbelieve. The friend had presented a paper analyzing the sharply different stances on both aesthetics and politics of two great current African writers, the Nigerian Wole Soyinka and the Kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o. At the end, the most prominent of all the academic Afrocentrists rose to denounce, in the most bitter terms, what had been said. He had no quarrel with any of the actual arguments put forward. He seemed barely to have heard them. His objections was more fundamental. He thought it simply wrong that a white person should dare to suggest that two Africans disagree with one another. As an American himself, albeit one born in Georgia, he knew it just could not be. All Africans share the same values. End of argument, so far as he was concerned. But if the Africa of the Afrocentrists is an imaginary place, then so, arguably, is their America. Their ideas, like cultural nationalism in general, quite simply have nothing at all to say about the most central problem facing Afro-Americans, the conditions of economic marginality, insecurity, and underprivilege under which most of them exist. The cultural nationalist stress on ethnicity to the cultural exclusion of all else may have done some good in addressing the handicaps of low self-esteem, which is a legacy of Euro-racism and perhaps of slavery. Or rather, since the Afrocentrists and cultural nationalists come overwhelmingly from the black middle class, or aspire to it, it addresses problems of self-image and others' negative perceptions, which most affects them. Economic analysis and programs for economic reform are simply absent, unaddressed, as Orlando Patterson lamented over 20 years ago. All this, of course, simply plays into the hands of the American establishment, for there is no concerted attack on the economic root cause of the problem, an attack which involves real concessions if it is to be met by other means than repression. Ironically, the cultural and symbolic demands emphasized by most black leaders are all too easily met. It was ridiculously easy for the establishment to respond by changing the color of a few faces in their ads, by publishing a spate of third-rate books on the greatness of the African tradition, by the glorification of black roots. Patterson, 1977, page 155. Afrocentrism today responds to the ever-deepening crisis of the black American poor by demanding more of the same.